Good afternoon. All right. So, as Steve said, I'm going to be talking about the Irish in World War I, in the First World War. This is actually a very interesting topic because there are many different ways of looking at it, from an Irish nationalist perspective, from an Irish home rule perspective, from the perspective of the Irish over here in America, and then also from the British perspective. And I'm actually going to be looking at this today from the perspective of Irish home rule. And so if you were looking at this at a political spectrum, this is sort of more in the middle. This is more of a moderate way of approaching the First World War and the Irish War for Independence and Irish Civil War, which all came one after the other. So to basically explain what home rule is, home rule was the concept that said that Ireland would gain its own political sovereignty from the United Kingdom, but remaining within the British Empire. So Ireland would gain its own parliament, its own government, but it would still be under the auspices of the British Crown. And this whole process actually began pretty further back in time. In 1542, King Henry VIII made Ireland a kingdom under the auspices of the English Crown. And so from that time up until 1603, there were what were called the two kingdoms, England and Ireland, which were united as one, but not really united. In 1603, this became the three kingdoms when Scotland joined in this whole setup. And then from this union of three kingdoms, we got the United Kingdom in 1707, when Scotland and England came together to form the Kingdom of Great Britain. Essentially, they brought their parliaments together into one united parliament, which meets at Westminster. In 1801, Ireland joined this union, and we got the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with the parliament again in Westminster. And so by the time the First World War comes around, the United Kingdom was essentially set up and had been established for over a century at that point. And actually, by 1914, there were some strong proposals from throughout the British Empire for what was called an imperial federation, which was the idea that the imperial colonies and the home nations being England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales sometimes, and then the colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, would each get home rule, and there would be equal parts within an imperial federation, a new form of the British Empire. These proposals were very active in the late 1800s when Canada became a federation in 1867, when Australia became a Commonwealth in 1901, and in 1914, when Ireland, on its third try, got home rule from Britain. The idea that Ireland would become an equal part of an imperial federation with Britain became a reasonable possibility. There were just a few issues that came up with this. So in 1912, the Ulster Unionists, these were the communities up in the northeast of Ireland, who were themselves very anti-home rule. They were afraid that, as the saying goes, home rule would equal Rome rule, that essentially if there was a parliament in Dublin, that the Catholic majority in Ireland would take control of government. And so they, the Protestant minority, would lose all the power they had had for the past 2 centuries. So in response to this, the Ulster Unionists in 1912 signed what was called the Ulster Covenant in Belfast City Hall. And this was a pact which swore that they would do whatever they could to keep home rule from happening, even if that included using the force of arms. So that year as well, a number of Ulster Unionists who were more militant founded the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, which was the paramilitary wing of the Ulster Covenant group, and they were the ones who were going to be responsible for keeping home rule from happening using arms and using military methods if necessary. In response to this, the Home Rule Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by a man named John Redmond, who was an MP, they formed an equal paramilitary group called the Irish Volunteer Force, later the Irish Volunteers. They were founded in 1913. And this was initially entirely a home rule organization. It had nothing to do with Irish nationalism. Their goal was to make sure that home rule happened, that Ireland gained back its sovereignty, but that Ireland remained an equal and outstanding partner within the British Empire. So this was all going on. At the same time, I just want to bring this up to compare this. In Austria-Hungary, in Vienna, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne there, was actually proposing a similar setup. He was calling it the United States of Austria-Hungary, only in German. And so his idea was that all of the constituent peoples within the Austro-Hungarian Empire would get their own independent federal states within the empire. They would meet together, they would all be equal under the law, and that would promote more democracy and more equality within Austria-Hungary. The same idea was essentially this imperial federation idea. And so going into 1914, these in Britain and in the British Empire, the idea that the empire was going to be a democratic force for good was fairly prevalent. And actually, Irish nationalism was nowhere near as strong as you might think. At that point in time, it was very much on the fringes of Irish politics. So all this was happening, and pretty much the one event that caused none of this to actually take place was the assassination of the Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo in June of 1914. As soon as that happened, the First World War began. The Austrians declared war on the Serbians, the Russians declared war on the Austrians in defense of the Serbians, Germans declared war on the Russians in defense of the Austrians, French against the Germans and the Austrians in defense of the Russians, and then the British declared war on the Germans and the Austrians because the Germans decided to invade France with a stop in Belgium on the way. When Britain declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary, that meant that Ireland was also technically a belligerent party within the First World War. However, unlike in most other parts of the British Empire and most other parts of the United Kingdom, there was no conscription in Ireland. The government did not institute the draft in Ireland because even though nationalism had been very cool, very calm at the time, there was still a worry that if they instituted a draft, the majority of Irish people would rise up in revolt or at least protest against the government. And they didn't want to do that, especially during wartime, because they could lose a significant portion of their manpower in regards to the fighting. So in 1914, in August 1914, when the British Empire joined in the First World War, the general assumption was that the war would be over by Christmas, or at least by early 1915. And so the government at the time, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, who was a Liberal Prime Minister, the Liberal Party in Britain was actually very pro-Irish Home Rule, which was an interesting factor. Herbert Asquith said, we're going to make sure you guys get your Home Rule. However, for the duration of the war, it's going to be put on hold, because we're not going to make significant political changes to our country in the middle of wartime, which does make some sense, I'll say. Now, during the First World War, about 260,000 Irishmen served in the British Army, and following the entry of the United States in 1917, there were a significant number of Irish Americans and Irish immigrants who served in the U.S. Army. There were also, interestingly, at the time, some Irish nationalists who were working with the Germans, because the way they saw it, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so if they worked with Germany, in order to try and subvert British power, they could then possibly get Irish independence with the help of the Germans. So there was an Irish-born British diplomat named Sir Roger Casement who had gone AWOL and was in Berlin in 1915 and was actually trying to convince the German government to create an Irish regiment in the German army. And the idea was that it would be made of Irish POWs who had been captured on the Western Front, and they would be convinced to fight for Ireland, but in the German uniform, and they would go back to Ireland and join in a rebellion in Ireland. Casement actually went and met with some POWs in a number of camps in Germany. None of them agreed to join him. So it didn't work at all. Nonetheless, the Germans did arm the Irish nationalists, at that time it was the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And as we're going on with this, in 1914, when the war began, the majority of the Ulster Unionists, the Ulster Volunteer Force, did join up with the regular army to fight alongside the British Army on the Western Front. At the same time, about half of the Irish Volunteer Force went along as well and joined the army. The other half stayed in Ireland for various reasons, whether it be they didn't necessarily see themselves as having much of a say in the cause, or they just didn't want to take part. As the war began, the Irish nationalists, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, began to infiltrate the Irish Volunteer Force, to the aim of eventually taking the Irish Volunteer Force and turning it into their own military force that they could use in a future rebellion against the British government in Ireland. This eventually would play out in 1916 with the Easter Rising. those of you who were here yesterday would have heard a talk about the Easter Rising, and today at 3 o'clock you'll see a panel on the Easter Rising. Now, there were nationalist rebellions in the lead up to this period. In 1803, 1848, and 1867, those are the three main ones. Interestingly, from that, in 1848, the leaders of that rebellion came to America and became the commanders of the Irish regiments in the Union Army during our Civil War. While in 1867, the Fenians, as they were called, were both in the US and in Ireland, and the ones in America attempted to invade Canada, which was then recently federated, but still a dominion within the British Empire. And the idea there was that if they could hold Canada hostage, they could convince the British government in Westminster to give Ireland its independence. They lost, and actually as a result, Canada did choose to come closer together, and the modern state of Canada exists today because of it. So, before 1916, before the Easter Rising, the majority of the population in Ireland was in favor of home rule. And the Irish Parliamentary Party, which argued in Parliament for home rule and fought for home rule, and their portion on the ground, which was called the Land League, particularly in the 1870s and 80s, were the most popular party in Ireland. They were sort of the equivalent, you could say, of the Scottish National Party up in Scotland today, or of Plaid Cymru in Wales. And their main argument was that we need to remain in the empire, we need to work this out civilly, we don't need to be fighting about this, because the rebellions in the past hadn't worked. And essentially, if we just talk it over with the British, eventually they'll agree with us and say, yeah, we need to let them do their thing. So the Irish home rule was still on the table come 1916 when the Easter Rising happened. And actually, home rule did finally take place in 1920 when there were two separate parliaments set up. There was a parliament in the north and a parliament in the south. However, the Parliament of the South was not at all recognized by the majority of the population at that point, which had switched to become pro-nationalist. So, essentially, home rule was entirely based upon the principle that Ireland could remain an equal part within the British Empire, and that Ireland could have its say within the empire, and then work out its problems without fighting, without war, without violence. Didn't come to play that way, and interestingly though, I would say that if home rule had happened, we would see Ireland in the same position where it is today, because of the 1912 Ulster Covenant, which essentially did cause the split between the North and the South from that point on. Now, in regards to the war itself, to the First World War itself, the interesting thing that you'll find if you're traveling around to Britain or in Ireland, and I got to experience this when I was living in London this past year, is that in Britain you find many, many more memorials for the veterans and the dead from the First World War. Every village in England will have a memorial to the honored dead, as they'll call them. And my friend Luis Martinez actually referred to British military remembrance as being positive nationalism, in the sense that it's sort of like if we sing God Bless America during the 7th inning stretch of a World Series game. It's that kind of nationalism as opposed to being very violent or very anti-someone else. Whereas in Ireland, not that there's any negative nationalism, but really you don't see nearly as many memorials to Irish veterans in the First World War. And I think this can largely be explained in the fact that if you consider that in 1914, when the war began, Ireland was still, by majority, in favor of home rule and in favor of staying in the empire, at least for that point. However, in 1918, the war for independence had already started, and by then, the vast majority of the population was in favor of leaving the British Empire and forming a republic. And so, as it was said by some soldiers at the time, Ireland was a completely different country in 1918 when they returned from the war than it was when they left in 1914. And so many of the veterans of the British Army from the First World War who came from Ireland were not recognized and were not celebrated in the same way that their counterparts from Wales, England, or Scotland were. This actually has continued up until close to the present day, and only recently has the Irish government gone in and done their part to commemorate the veterans of the First World War, with taking part recently in the commemorations of the centennial for the Battle of the Somme in France. The CHASOC was there alongside some of the top British officials and French officials. So, essentially, considering the Irish in the First World War, we need to consider the fact that this is a tumultuous time in Irish history. This is one of the biggest sea changes in Irish history. However, I wouldn't necessarily say that this change is solely an Irish change, because if you look around in other countries in Europe that gained their independence in 1918, 1919, 1920, many of these countries have similar experiences. Whether you're in Finland or in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, or even if you're looking at somewhere like, say, Germany, where though they didn't necessarily gain their independence, they had a revolution in 1918. Same with Russia, with the Russian Civil War from 1920 to 1924, where the veterans of the First World War who fought under the flags of the old empires were not respected to the same extent that you might see the veterans of the Second World War who would have fought under the national flags. And so it's an interesting period in European history, but particularly in Irish history, because unlike the other ones, in Ireland, you did not have as much of a conflict between far-right and far-left-wing factions in the country leading up to the First World War and then in the decades afterwards. There wasn't, it's the same way as there was in Finland or Russia, there wasn't a fascist versus communist war in Ireland following the First World War and the War for Independence. So, the major shift here came after the Easter Rising, as I said, and you'll hear this when you attend any of the talks on the Easter Rising. But as the Rising was going on, the majority of the population in Dublin particularly was not in favor of the Rising, because the Rising resulted in the destruction of the city of Dublin, for the most part. However, once the British authorities essentially overreacted and executed the leaders of the rebellion, that's changed things dramatically. And that is where we see the shift from being pro-home rule to being pro-independence. And there is a really fascinating statistical piece of data you can find if you look at electoral information in Ireland from the elections before the First World War to the ones just after. Before the war, the majority of the population, as I said, voted for the Irish Parliamentary Party. After the war, the vast majority voted for Sinn Féin, the Nationalist Party. And from that, we essentially get the perspective of the government as it has been since 1922. So, I'll open up to any questions if anyone has any.